The decision to invade Iraq in 2003 has proven to be a deeply unpopular one, and it was the decision that in fact finally rendered the American electorate adverse to intervention in the Middle East. George Bush Sr. enjoyed very high approval ratings for his part in presiding over the Gulf War, and public opinion on the invasion of Iraq to remove Saddam Hussein from power was strong throughout the 90s. Support for the invasion was of course boosted considerably by 9/11 and the declaration of the so-called War on Terror, but really this was just granting a marketing opportunity to neoconservatives who were keen on pursuing this war regardless, and had been for a very long time. When talking to people about it, you're probably going to encounter a lot of adamant opinions that the war can be reduced down to single motivating factors, for example that it was to do with access to oil or the prevention of terrorism. But in practice it took place for a confluence of reasons, and I'm hoping to address most of these over the course of the video. The motion of actually invading Iraq had been on the US policy agenda for at least a decade. Diplomatic relations with Iraq deteriorated during the late 80s and turned actively hostile by the early 90s. The Iraq Liberation Act of 1998 is a US congressional statement of policy stating, and I quote, "It should be the policy of the United States to support efforts to remove the regime headed by Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq." Now, the basis for this policy is elaborated on within the Act. It states that between 1980 and 1998, Iraq had committed various and significant violations of international law. It had failed to comply with the obligations to which it had agreed following the Gulf War, and it had further ignored resolutions of the United Nations Security Council. This was enacted following the expulsion of UN weapons inspectors, and it was followed by a consistent and aggressive bombing campaign by the United States and the UK right up until the invasion in 2003. And so you can see that in many respects, the US was already at war with Iraq, and that the gears were in motion for what was later going to happen. 5 years later, when it came to the actual invasion in 2003, the three stated reasons given by President Bush were: 1. To disarm Iraq of weapons of mass destruction, 2. To end Saddam Hussein's support for terrorism, and 3. To free the Iraqi people. Now, for the purposes of my defense of the incentives to invade Iraq in 2003, I'm going to generally avoid the terrorist argument, and that's not because there's nothing to it. Saddam was never suggested to have orchestrated 9/11. It was more that they wished to try and reduce the terrorist risk, and Saddam had funded and cooperated with established terrorist organizations, including major-ranking al-Qaeda members who were found in Iraq following the invasion. But I think it's a weak argument for a few reasons. And the first of these, of course, is that when you make a decision as incendiary as invading somebody else's country, when terrorism was already in vogue, you are always going to give rise to a greater risk of radicalization and turning people to commit terrorist attacks who may otherwise not have done so. And that therefore means that you have to balance the positive impact of any terrorists who are found and accounted for in Iraq with the amount of terrorism that it engendered elsewhere. But the other reason I'm going to refrain from commenting too much on the terrorist dimension is that these terrorist attacks, as awful as they are for everybody involved, don't affect people on a per capita basis in the way that the other arguments, once elucidated, will prove to, whether we're talking about the well-being of people in Iraq or the international community at large. As alluded to earlier, terrorism and the threat of terrorism going forward was really nothing more than a marketing opportunity. It was observed by the neoconservatives in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, and it gave them an opportunity to try and draw on galvanized interest in the region to pursue a war that they'd been seeking to prosecute for years. So for these reasons, it's going to be the first and third stated reasons that will form the bulk of my defense. Now, as you're watching this, or anyone who does come to watch this, I can't imagine there'll be many of you, you'll probably be wanting to jump down my throat, and I promise that I will try to address most of the common criticisms of the decision to invade later in the video. I'm going to start by talking about the human rights justification for regime change, referred to in the Act under the broader heading of freeing the Iraqi people. Now, this is often reduced to this common misconception that the Americans were principally interested in implementing democracy into a country that would have otherwise been uninterested or unprepared for it. And while the Iraq Liberation Act does state an intention to, and I quote, establish a program to support a transition to democracy in Iraq, The humanitarian justifications it refers to are very grave violations of human rights. They go up and beyond any kind of concerns about democratization. And further, they're the kind of violations of human rights that really did distinguish Ba'athist Iraq from the imperfect regimes that were tolerated elsewhere in the Middle East at that time. Because what we're talking about here is a really grisly police state. It was one in which police checkpoints had been installed throughout the country to limit people's freedom of travel and ensure subservience. And it was a country in which there was no freedom to follow the majority Shiite religion due to Saddam Hussein's personal preference for Sunni Islam. And so you can see right off the bat that this is a country with civil liberty issues incomparable to Iran. In Iran, there's freedom of religion. Synagogues are all over Iran, and you can practice Sunni or Shia Islam, and Christianity for that matter. And so this other marketing ploy on the part of the neoconservatives, that being the identification of axes of evil, Iraq, Iran, North Korea, among others, was also deeply risible, because the human rights standards in North Korea are perhaps comparable, but none of the other countries reach the depths that we're talking about here. And these depths go much further than the civil liberty issues that have been discussed so far. These incursions into civil liberty frankly pale in comparison to some of the more grotesque policies that were in place there. Criticism of the president was punishable by amputation, and this typically took the form of people's tongues being cut out. And this is a practice that originated in the National Army, but was eventually introduced into the criminal justice system and applied to anyone who was heard to have said negative things about President Saddam. And some of the people who'd fallen victim to this draconian punishment were subsequently driven around in open-topped cars with blood pouring out of their mouths, so as to warn those who lived in the local area what was going to happen to them if they dared to comment on the regime. The headquarters of Saddam Hussein's secret police was a large complex which contained several floors beneath ground that were inaccessible via the normal elevator, and within these floors occurred some of the worst violations of human rights that are recorded in the last 50 years. The Global Justice Center was able to obtain documents that detailed the kind of tortures that were being practiced there, and it included crucifixion, people being mauled to death by dogs, all kinds of mutilation, women being tied to beds and having their babies tortured in front of them. And you hear these things, and it ought to give you some kind of a perspective about the regime that we're talking about here. It's quite possible that were these details to be more widely known, that you wouldn't see the kind of ardent opposition to the invasion that we see today. And yet, these things had been happening in Ba'athist Iraq on a mass scale, in accordance with the Iraqi legal system. There wasn't any legal infrastructure there to challenge these kind of activities. An ICJ report into Iraq's rule of law in '94 found that the Secretary General of the Regional Command essentially had full control. And while there were some checks and balances that existed among lower courts, the legal system had a habit of creating, quote, special courts, and these were established provisionally whenever the regime discovered a conspiracy against itself. Describing the constitutional parameters of these special courts, the ICJ states, and I quote, "None of the usual rules apply to these special courts. They do not provide the requisite safeguards in regard to the competence and impartiality of judges and their independence of the executive authority, nor do they guarantee the right of defense for persons referred to them for trial." And so it was courtesy of this system that Saddam Hussein and his immediate associates enjoyed impunity when pursuing these disgusting policies against people they deemed to be threats to the regime. Foreign Office papers had established that each execution or torture order was signed by an immediate member of Saddam Hussein's family or his closest advisors, and it added that such orders would allow the signatory to record how they want the victim to be tortured. And a man who was responsible for signing a great many of these orders was Uday Hussein, Saddam Hussein's son. And I think it wears worth to elaborate a little bit about the kind of person that he was and that was in control of the Iraqi government at that time, so as to elucidate my case for the human rights concerns over Ba'athist Iraq. Saddam had a habit of appointing immediate family members to important ministerial positions in the Iraqi government, and Uday was no exception to this, and so Uday held important offices throughout the Iraqi state. And the one that's most commonly referred to as his tenure as chairman of the Iraqi Olympic Committee. It was a position that Uday took very seriously and was a matter of personal pride for him, and so if athletes didn't perform to what he perceived an adequate standard, he would degenerate into these appalling rages in which he would beat and torture the athletes by cutting them with knives, locking them in coffins for great periods of time. And it actually became quite a big problem at competition because the Iraqi Olympic team needed to go about embellishing and concealing the injuries that the players had sustained by Uday during these tantrums. Uday had legal immunity under Iraqi law, and so he was able to rampage around the country, raping and harming people indiscriminately, knowing full well that he did so with full impunity as Saddam Hussein's son. He was a serial rapist, much like his father. He's known to have raped thousands of women, and documents obtained by the Ba'athist estate detail individual instances, both against Iraqi citizens and people visiting the country. For example, there's a report of the police having been called to a Iraqi hotel in which a newlywed couple were enjoying a honeymoon together and unfortunately crossed paths with Uday. Uday took a liking to the bride and demanded that she had sex with him, as was his habit, and when she refused, him and his bouncers had her dragged to his hotel room where he brutally raped her before she jumped off the balcony, committing suicide. And were there repercussions for this? No. The woman's husband attempted to try and defend her, and for doing so was beaten to an inch of his life by Uday and his bouncers. And when the police came, Uday explained the situation and had the husband executed for having betrayed the regime. Randomly targeting and raping young women had become such an entrenched part of Uday's routine that when a group of very brave Kurdish soldiers got together and orchestrated an assassination attempt on him in '96, they knew exactly where he'd be, because he was known at that time to drive around the block preying on university students to rape. And so the assassins were able to identify him in the area in his red Porsche, and they didn't succeed in killing him, but they did manage to cripple him for the remainder of his life, which unfortunately only served to intensify his perversions. Uday developed sexual dysfunction following the injuries sustained during the assassination attempt, and it was after this that he developed relationships with schools based around Baghdad, in which children would be sent over to him routinely for him to molest. The Kurdish assassins that orchestrated this attack had very good reason to feel embittered against the Ba'athist Iraq. Ethnic Kurds represented around 17% of Iraq's population, and they're very heavily concentrated then and now in the provinces of northern Iraq. Ba'athist Iraq was never really able to control Iraqi Kurdistan, and it faced constant resistance by Kurds who were forever seeking self-determination in defiance of Saddam Hussein's regime. The Kurds had been persecuted since at least 1970, but this persecution very rapidly accelerated during the late 1980s and eventually culminated into a direct genocidal campaign during the Al-Anfal period in 1988. And of the same year, a very grave gas attack was delivered against Iraqi Kurdistan by Saddam Hussein, who'd gone on record stating his intent to eradicate Kurds from the face of Iraq. Alongside that, may I add, the Marsh Arabs, who were another group that he detested and wanted to see ethnically cleansed from his country. During the late 80s, it's estimated that anywhere between 50,000 and 100,000 Iraqi Kurds were murdered, for the most part by the Republican Guard. And resistance on the part of Iraqi Kurds was met with very brutal repression in the form of mass indiscriminate killings, some of which personally participated in by Saddam Hussein himself. And these mass killings ought to be considered in combination to the Iraqi lives that were lost in Saddam's expansionist wars, those being his decision to invade Iran and then his decision to invade Kuwait. When aggregated, it suggested that as many as 1 million Iraqis died through these genocidal and expansionist wars. And that's not to mention the poverty that had been created by his regime. Saddam's actions had resulted in the Iraqi economy being essentially devastated, and their fiscal affairs were dire. Now, instead of assuming responsibility for the provision of basic public services, Saddam responded to these fiscal concerns by continuing to construct palaces for him and his family to enjoy across Baghdad. And this continued state of affairs, which of course weren't helped by the UN sanction regime, which I'll get to later, led to the most extreme form of poverty being endured by the working and especially lower working classes existing in Iraq prior to the invasion. UNICEF were coming out with estimates of as many as 30,000 people a year dying from the poverty. And so I think the accumulation of all of these factors have to be considered in totality. What we have here is a grim police state. We have Saddam Hussein and his officials going out committing the most atrocious acts against their own people with impunity. We have active genocide being consistently pursued against the Iraqi Kurds and the Marsh Arabs. We have hundreds of thousands more Iraqis dying in these ridiculous expansionist wars that Saddam Hussein had no hope in winning. And then we have tens of thousands of people dying from extreme poverty caused by this fiscal chaos and refusal by Saddam to invest more heavily in basic public provisions. And this gives rise to the big moral question, which is that people like to sit around and speculate as to what they'd have done if they were to lived under X totalitarian state. But we have to ask ourselves, well, what would you do if you lived in a country that was able to remove Saddam Hussein from power and put an end to this suffering? And that's not to say that the invasion itself didn't cause immense suffering, because it did, both in the form of members of the Republican Guard conscripted against their will to fight in a war that they may well have not supported, dying, but also civilians. Many civilians lost their lives during the invasion, and that's terrible. And it's further terrible to think that there are lots of people out there, for example, members of the Iraqi middle class who were leading normal lives prior to the catastrophe that will have developed in the wake of the invasion, until the transitionary government had been established. Because these things do need to be considered, but my argument here is that there's a certain baseline of behavior that a sovereign state has to fulfill. And when they plummet beneath those standards and they start to breach their fundamental rights obligations in this manner, that these things have to be overridden in order to protect people. And I say have to, I mean, you may well not agree with that. You may well be of the opinion that this suffering, while unfortunate, exists in another country and isn't the responsibility of the United States and its allies to intervene with. And fair enough, you're welcome to that view, but at the same time, I'd encourage you to consider any historical examples that you may support in terms of intervention. And I'm resisting the temptation here to bring up the Allied invasion of Normandy so as to liberate Nazi Germany. But another example would be the Korean War in the 1950s. Hundreds of thousands of American troops were deployed there to join South Korea and other members of the coalition forces against North Korea. And hundreds of thousands of people died during that war, and a lot of awful things happened. But at the same time, do you not look to the Korean Peninsula and notice that 2/3 of the Korean people now enjoy life in South Korea, while 1/3 languish in poverty in North Korea, and wonder how different it might have been were the United States to have assumed this laissez-faire international relations stance that's expected of them today? And it's an imperfect comparison for so many reasons, not least of all that the intervention in Korea was a UN-led one. But the salient facts are still the same, which is that on occasion it's necessary, or at least it's arguably necessary, to allow some suffering to take place in order to capture much greater peace, stability, and well-being of people living in the region. And that's not to say that I'd endorse any intervention, because on the contrary, I think that situations have to be very extreme for them to become warranted. But it is to say that there are circumstances in which interventions like these become justifiable. And that is a principle that was gaining traction in the 90s when it came to international law. And that's something I'm going to elaborate a little bit about now, because A, it very heavily influenced the climate in which the Iraqi war took place, and B, because the development of the principle of humanitarian intervention under international law during the 90s and the resulting wars that took place under it should help to furnish one's appreciations of what they can accomplish, and of course the consequences that can come with abstaining from such interventions. Now, prior to the advent of American hegemony in international affairs, and by that I mean to say prior to the fall of the Soviet Union, this wasn't a tenable approach for the most part, and this was accepted both by the United States and by the United Nations, and some really appalling genocides took place in countries such as Cambodia in the 1970s and Uganda in the 80s. Intervention anywhere by the United States, its allies, and the Soviet Union had to be taken very seriously so as not to elicit hostilities in their dynamic, and this of course was due to the threat of nuclear war, and why acts of containment such as that in Korea and then again in Vietnam, among other places, were isolated on the basis of the containment strategy. But with the Soviet Union out of the picture, during the 1990s, the United Nations was able to provide humanitarian interventions in order to protect people from the genocides that were occurring in Bosnia and then again in East Timor. And note that the United States was chiefly funding these operations, and so it's not a matter of oil-rich countries in which more insidious motives can be brought into question. It instead demonstrates that the principle of humanitarian intervention was beginning to gain some traction in international relations. And this was something that, during the 90s, the United Nations had sought to obstruct. A watershed moment came in Rwanda in '94, when an appalling genocide, which left close to 1 million people dead over a matter of 2 weeks, demonstrated the United Nations' inadequacy at protecting the international community in a world that no longer required the kind of cutthroat, cynical, non-interventionist principles that had otherwise taken hold during the Cold War in fear of nuclear apocalypse. And all of this came to a head in Kosovo in '98, when Russia used its United Nations Security Council veto to block intervention to protect people in Kosovo from the Serbian oppression. Milosevic, who was in power at that time, was going about murdering thousands of people and forcing hundreds of thousands to flee the country. The Clinton administration decided to act in defiance of this United Nations Security Council decision, and they did so under two bases. First, that the intervention in Bosnia had been wholly successful and recognized as such by most parties, and second, that the disgusting genocide that took place in Rwanda happened so rapidly that even though the UN did eventually acquiesce to the demands to intervene, that the rapidity with which these things could degenerate demonstrates that the UN was incompetent at intervening in time. And that by the time that the UN came to endorse the war, which they did, by the way, too many people would have died in the region. Milosevic was convicted of genocide, among other things, and committed to imprisonment at The Hague, and the earth exhaled. Because had the initiative not been taken here by NATO, thousands would have continued to die because of Milosevic's actions, and the United Nations came to embrace this. In response to the success in Kosovo and the failure in Rwanda, the United Nations commissioned a report, and this gave rise to the principle of the responsibility to protect. And this is a principle that was endorsed by all member states of the United Nations at the World Summit, including Russia, by the way. And it details a principle that, while generally speaking, the Article 2.7 provision of the UN Charter prohibiting interference in domestic jurisdiction will stand, that there are circumstances in which truly abhorrent violations of human rights or infractions under humanitarian law are taking place will override this. And it frames the intervention in Kosovo as, and I quote, illegal yet legitimate. And so there we have it. At the turn of the century, the state of the world is one in which these kind of humanitarian interventions were gradually coming to be accepted. And it was against this climate that George W. Bush, Tony Blair, and the leaders of the other coalition forces decided to invade Iraq in defiance of UN obstruction. And I say obstruction loosely because while Chirac, president of France at that time, had made it clear that he intended to do everything he could to obstruct a UNSC approval of intervention in Iraq, no such vote actually took place. And George W. Bush did go and ask them. It wasn't something that he pursued without consulting the UN. But when it became apparent that Chirac was going to make a nuisance of himself, and by the way, I should add that Chirac was later charged with conspiracy owing to oil interests in the region that were suggested to have influenced his indefatigable opposition to the intervention in Iraq, Saddam Hussein having limited oil sales to most countries, not including France and Russia. It was only after these events that the invasion took place. And even then, while the UN expressed some condemnation initially, resolutions passed after the invasion recognized the legitimacy of the coalition forces in the region and accepted their role in helping a transitionary government take hold. And so even this notion that the decision was illegal under international law is a hazy one, and one that's never been vindicated by litigation in the ICJ or elsewhere. No one's ever been able to successfully charge coalition forces with the crime of aggression, or war crimes for that matter. And so all we have here really is a state invasion undertaken without a UNSC resolution, but this is really rather common. All UNSC member states have gone to war without UNSC approval. And so I'm sorry to have digressed for so long into that tour around the development of humanitarian intervention during the 90s under international law, but I think it's necessary because to understand why the decision to invade Iraq contrary to a UN mandate took place, it's very much necessary really to trace through the 90s and see what happened in Rwanda and what happened in Kosovo, and how these issues of human rights had come to take a more dominant role in the evaluation of whether an intervention would be deemed justifiable. And it conferred some discretion onto the United States and its allies to feel legitimized in their efforts to liberate the Iraqi people from the atrocious regime that they'd been subjected to for so long. But I mean, I should say right now, do I happen to think that this was a major priority for the neoconservatives? No. No, not at all. I think that it was a factor, and it was a factor both stated, but also that can be inferred from their actions once they took control of Iraq. Saddam Hussein was put on trial and executed, as were other key members of his police state. The Iraqi Kurds finally were relieved of the persecution that they'd been experiencing and were now represented in government for the first time in decades. And a gargantuan amount of money was spent by coalition countries in order to try and reconstruct Iraq. The reconstruction fund alone spent around $60 billion. And so, while I personally would rather have seen this war presided over by some lovely liberal, and while I happen to believe that the neoconservatives' chief objection to Saddam Hussein's regime related to the issue of weapons of mass destruction, which I will turn to later in this massive video, that doesn't preclude the benefits of the outcome. And although certain planning and logistical details could have been better implemented so as to minimize casualties, among other problems with the invasion strategy, the outcome is still to be celebrated, that being the downfall of Saddam's government and its horrific human rights violations. Unfortunately, on this occasion, it was probably the actions of the more liberal president, that being Barack Obama, that gave rise to the demise of the successes that had been secured by the invasion. And this is because the new Iraqi government, much like the Germans subsequent to World War II, depended on coalition forces to maintain law and order while they went about engaging in this transitionary period. And the architects for the invasion were very much of the opinion that troop levels needed to be maintained in the area. And in 2007 we saw a huge troop surge in accordance with this belief. And so while I'm going to fall short of claiming that George W. Bush was a preferable president to Obama, on this occasion Obama and his administration ought to be lamented very seriously for their catastrophic decision to withdraw from Iraq and the ensuing consequences that followed. Now, the other issue that I said I was going to address in my defense of the decision to invade Iraq and the issue that I think was probably at the foremost of the neoconservatives that orchestrated the invasion was that of the weapons of mass destruction, and this is something that's been ridiculed widely since 2003. And I think the basis for this ridicule emanates from the fact that no fully functioning weapons of mass destruction were seized following the invasion. But this mistakes the very fabric of the weapons of mass destruction justification that existed at that time. And the first reason for this is that Saddam Hussein had a history of lying about the stockpile that he maintained. So in 1999, he declared that he possessed a stockpile contrary to the non-proliferation treaties, but refused to inform a UN inspector as what he'd done with it. It's supposed to be classified and neutralized by the UN, but instead he disposed of it by other means. And so we're unlikely to ever know exactly what weapons he possessed at the time of the invasion, because once the threat of invasion became real, he went about destroying the arsenal that he possessed, including weapons that were in development. UN weapon inspectors sent to Iraq during the 90s, and not American ones I should emphasize, UN weapon inspectors, concluded that Iraq had been working on WMDs on a grand scale since at least 95. And it was further confirmed that another of Saddam's sons was in charge of a concealment program that was designed to try and deliberately deceive the UN as to what kind of nuclear weapons were being developed. So it was never challenged by anyone. It was never challenged by the UN, the United States, or otherwise, that Saddam Hussein was pursuing nuclear weapons, because this was accepted across the board. The UN had also established that Saddam had illegally acquired necessary ingredients to aid in the process of the development of nuclear weapons, and diplomatic cables acquired between North Korea and Iraq found that Saddam Hussein's government had been going about soliciting information from North Korea as to how to advance this project. Weapons inspectors generally, including David Kelly, who was generally considered to have been quite generous towards Saddam's regime, stated, and I quote, "No credibly sufficient inspection can be conducted under Saddam. The long-term threat of weapons of mass destruction is something that only regime change will avert." And this is a view that was endorsed by the UN's chief expert, Rolf Aekius, and then also contained in David Kaye's report. And meanwhile, intelligence services were constantly having to follow up on very worrying information that Saddam Hussein was a matter of years from developing a nuclear weapon. And this happened in Germany under Chancellor Schroeder, who was told that the Iraqi government was 3 years from having a properly functioning nuclear weapon at their disposal. And that doesn't mean to say that Dick Cheney and Alistair Campbell, among others, didn't go out of their way to exaggerate the imminency of this threat, because on the contrary, they almost certainly did. But that does not in any way invalidate the established fact that Saddam Hussein was intent on acquiring nuclear weapons in defiance of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and despite endless diplomatic efforts to prevent him from doing so. And so we get to 2003, and following the invasion, no undestroyed weapons of mass destruction are found. And that's supposed to be a bad thing? No, it's good. Saddam Hussein's demented regime had been prevented from finishing work on nuclear weapons that they had been resolute in pursuing and fastidious in concealing. They were verifiably disarmed. Now, everything that I've just said in relation to this weapons of mass destruction point is predicated on the assumption that Ba'athist Iraq, having access to nuclear weapons would be a bad thing. And an argument that you often hear floating around is this equivocation of the Soviet arsenal, or even the American arsenal, to weapons being developed in Iraq. And this argument, which on face value has some credence, is to say, how can it be justifiable for the United States to maintain such a massive arsenal of weapons whilst simultaneously restricting other countries from being able to develop their own? Indeed, in a moment, I'm going to spend some time talking about how degenerative Saddam Hussein's mental state was, and how his personal character meant that the risk that he posed is actually greater than the risk that would be posed by similar regimes that exist elsewhere in the world gaining nuclear capabilities. And a common riposte that I encounter regarding this is the observation that the United States President's sanity is often brought into question too. And yet the United States President controls, or ostensibly controls, the United States of America's nuclear arsenal, which is by far the most deadly. But the difference is that the American system contains so many checks and balances in place to try and prevent misuse of the nuclear arsenal. And these limitations of executive power in the American legal system are extensive, but the most significant ones here are the 6 layers of defense, all of which have to be passed before any nuclear strike can be ordered by the president. And these are intricately designed hurdles that are put in place before the president in the form of codes and executive orders that have to be signed off, so as to prevent the president from launching a reckless nuclear strike without there having been proper discussion as to the merits and risks that arise from taking such an action. Now, returning to Iraq, do you think it likely that the Ba'athist regime would have contained these kind of checks and balances designed to curtail Saddam Hussein's personal power over a nuclear weapon? Similar checks and balances were found in the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union exhibited a much more sophisticated legal system than that found in Iraq, as detailed by the ICJ's report I mentioned earlier. And in light of this, were Saddam Hussein to have successfully developed nuclear weapons, the world would then be at the mercy of Saddam Hussein's personal decision-making on the subject of whether to use these weapons or not. And as crazy and self-destructive as any decision to use nuclear weapons on his part would be, I don't think it's something that we can safely say was beyond his capacity given the actions that he undertook during his time as president. He had taken the decision to invade Iran in 1980, which was a confrontation that there was no chance Ba'athist Iraq was capable of winning at any point in the war. Admittedly, Iran had been temporarily weakened by the events of 1979, but their much stronger economy and superior army meant that Saddam's decision to invade without concrete support from other powers was really a death wish, and he's lucky that it didn't spell the end of his regime then. He then went on to invade Kuwait in 1990, even though reprisal from the United Nations and the United States was inevitable. And given what's been discussed so far, it's very unfortunate that American forces took the decision, having banished Ba'athist Iraq from Kuwait, not to push forward to Baghdad and execute regime change once and for all. Because this had been on the agenda, and coalition forces did enter into Iraqi territory. But luckily for Saddam, there was too much trepidation on the part of Colin Powell and George Bush Sr. to take the step to support the Kurdish uprising and overthrow Saddam Hussein from Ba'athist Iraq once and for all. But you can see how this second decision, that being the invasion of Kuwait in the following Gulf War, represents another very high-risk, self-destructive adventure on the part of Saddam Hussein. Indeed, subsequent to the Gulf War, Saddam even orchestrated an attempted assassination on George Bush Sr. in 1993. And so if that doesn't speak volumes about the kind of precarious steps he was willing to take in furtherance of his personal megalomania, then I don't know what would. And there was no evidence to think that Saddam Hussein was beginning to calm down in his old age. His speeches were becoming increasingly demented, and decades in rule had given rise to very extreme paranoia that haunted him at all times. And yet, this is the man that we would be relying on to practice restraint. That is, if we didn't want to see a devastating nuclear exchange to take place. And the exact details of these hypothetical nuclear exchanges proved to be very controversial in the run-up of the war. An issue that was debated ferociously, both in Parliament and Congress, was whether the kind of nuclear weapons that Saddam Hussein was suspected of developing would be capable of reaching the United States, UK, and other coalition member states. And frankly, the likelihood of Ba'athist Iraq having developed ballistic missiles of that kind of range is pretty fantastical. And although a nuclear-armed Ba'athist Iraq would have presented the risk of associated terrorist organizations having access to these weapons, the chances of these weapons ever reaching coalition countries was always pretty slim, and something that was always being misconstrued and exaggerated in order to secure consent for the invasion. The primary risk of nuclear weapons being held in Ba'athist Iraq concerned states in the Middle East, and one state whose immediate security would have been jeopardized by Saddam Hussein having access to nuclear weapons is Israel. Saddam had gone on record on numerous occasions stating his desire for Israel and its inhabitants to be eradicated from the face of the earth, and so one can understand why they might have harbored some concerns about this. Now, of course, Israel itself has nuclear weapons, and while they've installed similar restraints on their use, we can make no mistake that they would retaliate if a war were ever to have been triggered by Saddam. And so therefore we have to account for the number of Iraqi and Israeli lives that would have been lost during such an exchange. And it's not just Israel that would have been threatened by a nuclear-armed Ba'athist Iraq. a lot of residual hatred persisted following the war with Iran, and Iran themselves were desperate to develop a nuclear weapon in order to defend themselves from Iraq's pursuit of one. And this is where the issue of deterrence comes into play, because Iran was much more amenable to a nuclear weapons deal once Iraq's nuclear weapons program had been shut down. And this will be firstly because a very dangerous adversary of theirs, who was liable to volatile behavior, had been prevented from accessing nuclear weapons, and this of course lessened the need for Iran to develop one for themselves. And secondly, the invasion of Iraq had demonstrated that the era of the United Nations threatening smaller countries into adherence under the non-proliferation treaties was over, and that the United States, if necessary, would invade to ensure that the non-proliferation treaties were honoured by dangerous countries. And so it's no coincidence, really, that Iran stopped resisting diplomatic efforts towards a nuclear deal in the immediate aftermath of the invasion. And this is something we can see elsewhere, because we saw a very hasty compliance on the part of Colonel Gaddafi in Libya, who had been rejecting requests for examination of his WMD stockpile by the UN prior to the invasion of 2003. And so this means that the invasion brought with it a general non-proliferation of weapons in the Middle East, and given the Arab Spring that took place 10 years later, we can see how highly fortunate that is. Because imagine if the paramilitary organizations that came to rise during the Arab Spring had had access to these sort of weapons. And so I'll end my justification arguments there. I'd intended to include within this video some consideration of the main criticisms that get thrown around a lot of the decision to invade in 2003, but I think in light of how massive this video has become, that's going to have to be uploaded as a part 2. And so instead, I'll end this video with some closing thoughts. And those are that the society we now live in assumes, or at least the vast majority of people you'll meet, assume that the invasion of Iraq was a mistake. It's one of those common sense pieces of knowledge that you hear thrown around all the time. And what I'd urge you to do is to challenge these people and say, well, hold on a moment. What is it exactly that you lament about the loss of Saddam Hussein's regime? Was it the well-being that he brought to his own people through his persistent use of torture and genocide? Or was it the peace and stability that he offered to the region with his endless expansionist wars and ridiculous obsession with developing a nuclear weapon? Because if these aren't things to be lamented, then it raises questions about contemporary Middle East policy. Hopefully I'll get an opportunity on another day to have a long rant about why the decision not to impose a no-fly zone on Syria in 2011 was so devastating in ramifications. But once Trump is out of the White House, motions to try and intervene in Syria will be tabled again. And when this happens, I'd like to see a new generation of voters that are at least more open-minded to hear the arguments in favour of intervention. Because these interventions are nothing new. They can be observed throughout modern history, and as horrible as the process can be, the standard of life we enjoy today is predicated on our ancestors having gone out and confronted these regimes that were intent on harming people, and that's something that we all ought to reflect on.